Hello, my name is Kristina Kleutghen, and I'm the David W. Mesker Associate Professor of Art History and Archaeology at Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you for joining me here today, and special thanks to the Digital Orientalist for organizing this conference and extending an invitation. I've long been a fan of Digital Orientalist, and this is a real privilege to speak to you. So today I'll be talking about the Qing Emperor's Hindustan Jades, IIIF, QGIS, and Leaflet as tools for digital art history. In China during the second half of the 18th century, the Qianlong Emperor actively collected carved jades from across the Islamic world. Although these precious exotic items arrived from Mughal North India, the Ottoman Empire, Central Asia, and Xinjiang province, the Qianlong Emperor referred to them collectively as Hindustan Jades, referring, at least in his mind, to the geography of Muslim North India. He wrote many poems about these objects, which he then ordered incised on some of those very same objects. Now, by using IIIF, QGIS, and Leaflet, this project aims to map the objects over time and space, bring them together from their now dispersed circumstances, and to link their texts and images in bilingual English-Chinese presentation in order to make the material available to a much wider audience. The combination of digital tools not only expands public access to the objects, but also links those objects, their texts, geographic origins, and current locations to provide a much broader picture that transcends the textual understanding of China's international engagement during the global 18th century. So the project begins with the addition of Xinjiang to the Qing Empire following the Central Asian campaigns of 1755 to 1760. And this is the set of campaigns that ultimately added this massive region in Central or Inner Asia to the Qing, significantly expanding its previous boundaries. Now, the Qianlong Emperor, who reigned from 1736 to 1795, this is his project, and he is also an extremely passionate collector and connoisseur and writer of poetry, especially about his objects and his collections. Now, his poetry is noted more for its quantity than its quality. Nevertheless, that gives us an interesting textual source, which, when combined with the actual objects that inspired those poems, allows us to gain new insights into what he is thinking, what he is doing, and what is actually happening in between the rhetoric and the reality. So when I talk about the Hindustan Jades, I'm using his understanding of the term Hindustan. And here's one example. This is a Mughal jade bowl. It's shaped like a flower, carved into that form. It's important to note that jade is not actually carved. Technically, it is too hard. It must be abraded. So this is an incredibly labor-intensive object, from mining the jade or collecting it, and then to ultimately transforming it into the finished object, and finally, after it reached the Qianlong court, to have his poem incised into the vessel walls, which are so thin as to be translucent. Now, we know when he wrote the poem on this. The poem, as you can see, the characters dated on the object here, dates it to 1770. And we know that he would have acquired this object between 1768 and 1770. So this is one of his earliest Hindustan jades. And we can put the date of 1768 onto this earliest set of objects, because the first objects he discussed or identified as being from Hindustan only began in 1768. So we have a very short time period for these objects and for their related texts, only 1768 to 1799. So I started working on this project for a particular chapter in an edited volume. And if you are interested in reading that preliminary scholarship, very traditional, you can download it for free at my woostel.academia.edu page, and the citation is given here. But how does the emperor actually get these objects, and how does this connect to digital humanities? So this is actually a question that would probably have very much interested the Qianlong Emperor because it has to do with mapping. And you can see from the map here the procedure by which Qianlong acquired his Hindustan jades. Specifically, first, nephrite jade, which is different than jadeite, but this is what we are referring to when we say jade here. Nephrite jade is mined in Khotan. Khotan is now part of Xinjiang province, and Xinjiang was added to the Qing Empire at the end of the Central Asian campaigns in 1759. Now, historically, the raw jade that was mined in Khotan, even before it became part of the Qing Empire, it was sent throughout Islamic Asia to be turned into a variety of decorative and functional objects. Now, in the second half of the 18th century, the Turkish and Mughal finished objects carved from that Khotanese and now Qing jade are sent back to Xinjiang. The finished objects are purchased in places like Khotan or Kashgar, and they are ultimately sent to the Qianlong Emperor as imperial tribute. They could be sent by local officials, whether Muslim or Manchu, Mongol or Han, and finally, when they make it to Beijing, the emperor assesses them as Hindustan jades, regardless of whether they were carved in the Ottoman Empire or in the Mughal Empire or somewhere else in the Islamic world. And if he is suitably impressed, the emperor would compose a poem and have that poem incised onto the object. So this got me thinking when I'm working through the original project, toponyms stand out as consistently being present as part of the poetry corpus here. And so in an initial mapping experiment, I actually mapped a small quantity of the toponyms just to see what I could learn from that. And while the majority of the toponyms mention Hindustan, the second and third most popular toponyms were the Kunlun Mountains, the area around which the jade was mined, but also an area that now fell for the first time within the Qing Empire, and just India generally. So my question was, why is this even happening? Because there is no trade or diplomatic relationship even between the Mughals and the Qing at the time. So this gave rise to the research questions and the significance that I'm investigating in this digital project. So first, major research question is, what can we learn about 18th century intra-Asian interactions by studying Qianlong's practices of collecting Hindustan jades, writing poems about some of them, and ordering those poems incised into the objects? Now this matters because, as I mentioned, there's no formal Qing diplomatic or trade relationships with the Mughals or with the Ottomans at that time. And indeed, the Qianlong Emperor is not even known to have used the term Mughal Empire, even though it certainly existed. And the Ottoman term only appears with extreme rarity. Second, the Qing geographic conception of Hindustan as effectively being limited to Muslim North India is much smaller than the geography across which these vessels originate. So stylistic comparison in the 21st century indicates many different objects from different places were all equally conceived of as being Hindustan jades. And third, there's an unusual Qing imperial reliance here on foreign imports rather than domestic imitations, which are far more common when he is producing or having produced exoticizing decorative arts. And this is true for European style as well as Japanese style Islamic decorative arts at the time. So second, why use digital art history methodology and digital humanities tools to research answers to this question? Why is that necessary? So first, the data set is simply too large for manual processing. We're talking about approximately 80 texts that exist in anywhere from 1 to 4 versions, depending on whether a text has an extant object onto which it was incised and how many other different times in the period it was published. There are about 60 known objects incised with these texts, and more appear at auction with surprising regularity, actually. And also, some different objects are incised with the same text, so it's not like there's a one-to-one relationship all the time. That also complicates matters. The objects are also dispersed worldwide, so comparing them side by side is not possible in person. There are also multiple comparisons that are necessary. Incised text is not the same as the printed text. The printed text includes typically additional footnote or endnote or explanatory material. Sometimes certain characters are different. This does have an impact on the meaning, of course. Objects, comparing style and form, it's a very standard art historical procedure, but again, we can't do this in person. And sometimes, again, with that same text on the different objects, we need to know what is different, what is the same, and why. And finally, in order to present all this to an audience, it has to be a dynamic publication. It needs to be interactive. It needs to present all of this material together: text, image, object, maps, historical and contemporary. And most of the time, we just can't do that in a standard peer-reviewed publication. So, the project principles that I'm functioning under here are these four. Digital art history is number one. Interactive visualizations for number two. Open everything. What does that mean? We'll get to that. And then fourth, but not least, to mentor students. So I want to walk you through these principles and show you why. So first, digital art history. Specifically, this means that, of course, in art history, objects communicate, and they do that differently from text. But in digital art history, we have the added component of the fact that although we are also maintaining that objects are more important than texts for our purposes, but also that the 2D images with which we are working are not the same as three-dimensional objects. And all of the jades we're talking about here are three-dimensional objects. They're not flat. They need to be held and rotated and turned in order to understand the interaction between the object and the text. And a static two-dimensional image simply doesn't achieve that. Project principle number two is interactive visualizations. So we're taking the text comparisons here, multiple types of text, the text that's incised on the extant objects, the text that's printed in imperial poetry collections, the text that's printed in period geography sources or mapping sources or any sort of gazetteer. Those are not necessarily the same texts, and certainly the texts that are printed are not the same as the texts that are on the objects. So going back to that issue of toponyms and mapping, this is where I'm using QGIS to actually do the mapping, to map those toponyms, count those place names, and then to present it using Leaflet. Very lightweight, open source JavaScript library that's also very good for being mobile friendly as well as interactive. And the great thing about Leaflet is that it is compatible with IIIF, and this is an image presentation, comparison, and annotation framework. Now, why use QGIS and Leaflet rather than ArcGIS or ArcGIS Online? In fact, this project's mapping began in ArcGIS. There's a lot of benefits there. It's comprehensive, it's widely used. I do have access to it through my university, and in terms of students, it's a very transferable skill. But there is a pretty significant barrier to entry, somewhat unstable. It is also platform limited and expensive. Tried ArcGIS Online. It is a lot simpler than ArcGIS. It's also, again, available to me through my university, browser-based, cross-platform, but it doesn't support images and pop-ups. Historical mapping is somewhat variable. It is definitely not mobile-friendly. And again, closed source and costly. So using QGIS to actually do the mapping and then Leaflet to present the mapping makes a lot more sense to the project ethics than ArcGIS or ArcGIS Online. Second, IIIF, which stands for International Image Interoperability Framework, is how we're putting all this together. So This is a common set of metadata standards that are being used by museums and libraries, cultural institutions, software development companies, and a variety of other entities around the world to allow users like you and me to bring together different objects from different places, to annotate them, to compare and contrast, to zoom and pan, and to really do what we need them to do, even if it's not just objects in the same place. So what does this mean? This requires 3 APIs: image, presentation, and annotation. So if you see on the left, the diagram there gives you a basic image workflow. You start with the images and you serve those up. Then you have your object metadata and your structural metadata. Your object metadata is typically Dublin Core in this case. However, I'm personally partial to the metadata standard set by the Visual Resources Association, but really you can set any sort of internal metadata that you want. The structural metadata will be different depending on what you need your object and your server to do. You combine the object and the structural metadata into what is called a manifest. And once you have your IIIF manifest, then you can post that into your choice of any number of image presentation APIs, so that it can be human accessible. Now, we are using the Mirador presentation API because it is specifically facilitating of comparisons. It can also be multiple windows. So if I just pop up 2 images, as you see here, but maybe I want to incorporate a third, we can just add that in. You can add that in yourself. And so it's very interactive. It is extremely functional, and it also builds on a common art historical method of comparison. So this is essential here. What's great about this also is that it brings together images, texts, and maps because Leaflet is, again, IIIF compatible. The third principle for the project is open everything. And this really comes from a phrase by Murtha Baka in Introduction to Metadata, where she says, digitization does not equal access. And so the project principles really emphasize the idea of openness. What that means, open data and open scholarship, ultimately when this goes online, images that are open access, public domain, Creative Commons 0, and the like. And finally, using exclusively open source tools and software. Our 3 primary are, of course, QGIS, Leaflet, and IIIF, but you also see a short list at the bottom of the other tools that my team and I are using. Now, speaking of the team, that is the project principle number 4, specifically to mentor students. It is hard for students to get involved in faculty research in the humanities. I can't tell you how many times students have asked me, how do I do research in the humanities with a faculty member? You don't just join a lab. So I wanted to promote student involvement here, but also increase that collaboration in the humanities and break down the instructor-student divide that can be so hard to overcome. For humanities students especially, I wanted to encourage transferable skills and critical analysis, and especially digital literacy. But also, it's important to me to model both curiosity and resilience. And by resilience, I mean trying, failing, trying again, looking up the answer, failing again, failing better, and just showing that that is a normal part of research. It is not this nice, neat, linear path. And also showing that, I don't know everything, even as an instructor, believe it or not. So modeling that curiosity and resilience is important. And here I need to make particular mention to my student teams for the past 2 years working remotely who have really made incredible strides. I'm also proud to say that these are both all women teams, and so that has been a really rewarding experience to put this project actually together at its first steps with a team of undergraduate women students. So ultimately, these 4 project principles bring together a variety of different approaches to data visualization, but also with an emphasis on interactivity and openness and engaging students while still maintaining a commitment to the standard approaches of art history, in which case the object speaks and the object comes first, but bringing that into the digital realm. Thank you so much. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And if you would like to email me or follow up with a conversation, don't hesitate. My email is at the bottom of the slide here, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you so much.